Imagine standing in the quarry of Baalbek, beside a single stone so large that your entire body feels small in its shadow. You extend your arm, and your fingertips barely reach its base. You lift your eyes, and the top of the block rises like a cliff of carved limestone. It weighs as much as 15,000 adult men, yet it is shaped with purpose, like a brick meant for a wall. History tells us that the Romans cut and moved stones like this. The same Romans who recorded every triumph with meticulous pride, from the arches of their aqueducts to the details of their war machines. But about these colossal blocks in Lebanon, they left no inscription, no diagram, not even a rumor. How do you lift a stone weighing more than 1,200 tons and move it uphill without leaving behind a single record of the method? And what if the Romans did not build this foundation at all? What if they simply inherited something far older and far stronger than anything they ever designed? To explore a mystery of this weight, you must steady yourself. Allow gravity to settle your body. Let the weight of your muscles sink into the mattress. Feel the heaviness that anchors you to the earth. With that calm in your chest, come with me to the Bekaa Valley, where the impossible stones wait in the quiet of the ancient ground. The investigation into Baalbek begins with weight. Not symbolic weight or historical weight, but literal mass pressing into the earth with a force almost beyond human comprehension. Before we can explore theories or forgotten technologies, we must build our foundation on something far more fundamental than archaeology. We must begin with physics, gravity, friction, pressure. These forces shape every object that touches the world, and they do not change for any civilization, no matter how ambitious or forgotten. Imagine standing in the quarry where the largest stones of Baalbek were carved. The ground beneath your feet is solid limestone, hard and ancient. The air is warm and dry. You place your hand on the rough surface of the cut block beside you. It feels cold, even under the morning sun. Your fingers move across the stone, and although the surface appears smooth, your skin catches on tiny ridges and grooves. These microscopic imperfections are the first clue to the mystery. They are small, but under the crushing pressure of more than 1,000 tons, they lock into the world like the teeth of a gear. Every object in contact with another object experiences friction. It is the force that prevents sliding. It is what keeps a ladder from slipping beneath your feet. It is what lets your shoes grip the ground. Without friction, everything would slide endlessly in every direction. With too much friction, nothing would move at all. Friction is the quiet law of the physical world that decides what can be moved and what must stay still. When the builders of Baalbek carved their blocks, they did not carve small stones. They carved monoliths so massive that they are closer in weight to modern ships than to construction materials. A fully loaded Boeing 747 weighs about 300 tons. The blocks at the base of Baalbek weigh more than 1,000 tons each. The largest known block still lies in the quarry, weighing around 1,600 tons. That is the weight of 5 jetliners compressed into a single stone. Now imagine that stone resting on the earth. The contact surface might look smooth, but under pressure, it becomes a battlefield of tiny ridges grinding into one another. Limestone against limestone. Each ridge presses down with such intensity that it fuses the surfaces in a grip almost impossible to break. This is static friction, the first enemy. It is the force resisting the start of movement. And as the weight increases, static friction increases as well. This is where the mystery begins to take shape. When you read stories about ancient engineering, you see images of workers pulling ropes, placing logs beneath stones, building ramps of dirt or brick. These methods work for loads of 10 tons, 50 tons, even 100 tons. But friction does not scale gently. It grows brutally. A stone 10 times heavier is not 10 times harder to move. It can be 100 times harder. The resistance grows faster than the strength of any human workforce. Picture an ancient team preparing to move one of the 3 massive blocks known as the Trilithon. Each block is more than 20 meters long and weighs around 800 tons. To modern engineers, this number is already beyond what most cranes can lift. Yet the builders at Baalbek not only moved them, but placed them with precision on a retaining wall, several meters above ground level. Before we even debate how they lifted the stones, we must understand how impossible it is just to make them slide. When a 1,000-ton block settles onto stone, the pressure on the contact surface becomes enormous. The friction coefficient of limestone on limestone is roughly 6/10. This means that to begin sliding the block, the force applied must be 60% of its vertical weight. For a stone weighing 1,000 tons, that force is equivalent to 600 tons of horizontal push. That is more force than the thrust produced by a modern jet engine. A team of workers pulling on ropes cannot produce even a tiny fraction of that force. Not 1%, not 1/10 of 1%. This is the heart of the obstacle. Before ropes break, before wood splinters, before any clever technique is applied, the stone simply refuses to move. The ground holds it in place with the same patience that holds mountains in place. If workers pulled on ropes, the ropes would snap. If they used animals, the animals would collapse. The stone would remain silent and unmoved. Think of the rollers often imagined in ancient reconstructions. Long wooden logs placed under the block, allowing it to roll forward as workers push from behind or pull from the front. For small loads, this works. For middle-sized loads, this works with difficulty. But for stones weighing 1,000 tons, wood changes behavior. The pressure beneath the stone is so intense that the logs flatten instantly. Even hardwood splinter. They are crushed like chalk beneath a hammer. To test this, modern engineers simulated weight distribution and found that no tree species, even the densest tropical hardwoods, can withstand that pressure. The block would not roll. It would sink. Then consider sledges. A stone placed on a wooden sledge might slide if lubricated, but friction on a sledge at this size becomes overwhelming. The heat generated by sliding 1,000-ton load on wood results in burning. The wood would char and break. The ground beneath would be gouged. The sled would dig into the path rather than glide across it. At this point, the ancient builders face a wall of physics. Everything they know collapses under the weight of the problem. Stones heavier than any known structure in the ancient world sit in the quarry waiting to be moved, but they cannot be moved with conventional methods. The force required to begin moving them exceeds what a team of hundreds or even thousands of people could produce. This problem does something unexpected. It strips away all romantic illusions about the strength of ancient workers. No amount of manpower can change the laws that govern friction. No army can apply the force required. The obstacle is not human weakness. The obstacle is physics itself. And yet the stones at Baalbek were moved. They were lifted. They were placed with precision. They were set so tightly that even today, in some sections, a blade cannot pass between them. This is the contradiction. A task that should be impossible was achieved. A feat that defies our understanding of ancient engineering was completed. This is where the mystery deepens. The physics does not lie. The stones do not lie. Something extraordinary happened here. Something that forces us to reconsider what ancient builders knew, or what tools they had access to. To continue this investigation, let us imagine an experiment. Not a theoretical sketch or a romantic illustration of ancient labor, but a practical demonstration set in the quarry itself. The goal is simple. Move the stone by the smallest possible distance. A shift of a millimeter would be enough to prove that the block is not immovable. Yet even this tiny displacement requires a force that challenges the limits of ancient and modern capabilities alike. In the experiment, engineers gather around the base of the monolith. They place steel plates under the edge to insert industrial sensors. A hydraulic system applies pressure in slow, measured increments. These devices can generate hundreds of tons of horizontal force without relying on human effort. As the pressure builds, the block responds not with movement, but with silence. The sensors record the resistance. The hydraulic pistons strain. The stone remains fixed. Only after a certain threshold does the block finally shift. The movement is almost imperceptible, a fraction of a millimeter, barely visible to the naked eye. But the amount of force required to achieve that tiny motion is staggering. This is the first lesson of the experiment. Before the stone moves freely, it must break its bond with the earth. The initial movement, called overcoming static friction, is always the hardest. But when the weight is 1,000 tons, static friction becomes an adversary that requires extraordinary strength. Now return to the ancient world. There were no hydraulics, no mechanical presses, no steel beams, and no uniform platforms. Everything depended on ropes, wood, and muscle. The contrast between the experiment and the ancient site becomes clear. If modern machinery struggles to move the block even slightly, how could ancient workers have done it at all? This question becomes even more complex when we consider the environment of the quarry. The ground at Baalbek is not a flat, polished floor. It is uneven. It slopes gently downward in certain areas and rises in others. The friction between the stone and the ground is not consistent. Some parts of the surface grip more strongly. Others lock into irregular depressions. These conditions make the problem worse, not better. One might imagine that lubricants could have helped. Water, oil, or animal fat might reduce friction enough to allow movement. But lubricants behave differently under extreme weight. A thin layer of oil does reduce friction for small loads. But when weight reaches 1,000 tons, the oil is pushed aside almost instantly. It cannot remain between the surfaces long enough to be effective. It is squeezed out like water from a sponge mashed under steel. The pressure is simply too great. This leads us to another critical factor. Pressure is not just a force of weight. It is the concentration of that force over a small contact area. The edges of the block exert enormous pressure on the ground. The corners dig in. The base grinds into the limestone beneath it. If the ancient builders planned to move the stone, they would need to distribute that pressure across a much larger area. But how could they do that without advanced materials? Wood fails. Metal is too rare and too weak in the ancient world. Rope does not reduce pressure. Ramps do not reduce pressure. Ramps only redirect force. The problem remains fundamentally the same. Pressure causes damage. If you tried to drag 1,000-ton block across the ground, it would leave deep scars in the rock beneath it. It would tear through soil. It would crush anything in its path. Yet at Baalbek, we do not see the kind of massive gouging that should accompany such attempts. The quarry shows clean cuts, defined edges, and incomplete blocks still attached to the mother rock. If attempts were made to drag the stones, we would expect to find huge trenches carved by the weight. Instead, the evidence suggests a more controlled process. This introduces a paradox. The stones appear to have been extracted with care, precision, and intention. But moving them with known ancient methods would have been a chaotic and destructive operation, leaving unmistakable scars. The absence of such scars suggests that the builders used a method that avoided dragging entirely. This is the second lesson of the physics. Whatever technique they used, it was not a brute force method. Another option often raised is lifting. Instead of dragging the stone, perhaps they lifted it with levers, jacks, or cranes. But lifting is even more impossible than dragging. The largest ancient cranes estimated from Roman records could lift around 30 tons at most. That number assumes perfect conditions and multiple cranes working together. For a 1,000-ton stone, you would need dozens of cranes, all synchronized with exact precision, all supporting the load equally. Any imbalance would cause catastrophic collapse. There is no evidence of cranes large enough or numerous enough to achieve this. The idea, while imaginative, collapses under engineering analysis. Consider the torque required to lift even a corner of the block. Levers only multiply force. They do not create force. If you require 600 tons of horizontal force to slide the block, you may require even more to lift one side. Ancient workers could wedge smaller stones beneath edges to create height, but only after the block was already in motion. Getting it to move upward first is a level of force far beyond human strength. Some propose that ramps were built, massive earthen ramps. But ramps solve only one part of the problem. They do not eliminate the need to overcome friction. They only change the direction of the force. A ramp does not allow the stone to float. It simply makes the path longer and more laborious. When the load is this heavy, ramps become geological structures. You would need thousands of tons of packed earth, shaped precisely, with a slope gentle enough to avoid catastrophic collapse. The construction of such ramps would have left enormous scars in the landscape, but no such scars exist. This brings us to one of the most important realizations in the entire segment. The problem is not merely the weight of the stones. The problem is the lack of evidence for any method that could have reasonably moved them. We know how ancient people moved moderate loads. We have records, depictions, and archaeological examples. But we have nothing, not a single inscription or relief, describing a method capable of moving stones at the scale of Baalbek. The silence is deafening. Imagine how proud a civilization would be if it discovered a breakthrough that allowed it to move stones the size of houses. Yet the Romans, who documented their achievements carefully, say nothing. The builders of Baalbek left no instructions, no celebration, no record. If they used a method that overcame friction in a way we still do not understand, they did not share it. The knowledge remains buried in the silence between the stones. The more we examine the physics, the clearer the contradiction becomes. The stones should not have been moved with the tools available in antiquity. And yet they were. The foundation exists. The blocks are in place. They sit with precision that challenges even modern standards. This is the third lesson. The builders achieved something that appears to cross the boundary between the possible and the impossible. To complete our understanding of this immense obstacle, we must now expand our perspective. Instead of focusing only on the mechanics of moving a block across the ground, let us consider the broader implications of scale. The challenge of Baalbek is not simply that the stones are heavy. It is that they cross a threshold where the behavior of materials changes. Wood, stone, rope, and earth behave differently under normal loads. But when the load becomes extreme, when weight rises into the realm of thousands of tons, these materials enter a domain where they fail in ways that ancient builders could not easily predict or counter. Begin by imagining the block as an object resting in a precise equilibrium with gravity. Every atom in the stone is being pulled downward with relentless consistency. The ground absorbs this weight and pushes back with equal force. This balance is what allows structures to stand. But when that balance is disturbed, even slightly, catastrophic failure can occur. A small shift in weight distribution can cause the stone to crack. A tiny deviation from a flat surface can cause the block to tilt and become impossible to stabilize. When the mass is this large, geometry becomes a form of gravity. Angles and surfaces become forces. This is why modern engineers rely on exact mathematical models when moving heavy loads. They calculate distribution, center of mass, shear strength, and structural integrity. These calculations require advanced understanding of physics, established over centuries. Yet the builders of Baalbek appear to have understood these principles intuitively or through inherited knowledge. The stone's surfaces are carved with remarkable flatness. Their angles are clean. Their weight distribution is so stable that the blocks remain lodged in place today, thousands of years after they were set. This level of precision raises a profound question. If friction is such a powerful enemy, how did the builders avoid the many ways in which the stones could have failed during transport? A block this large, once set in motion, does not stop easily. Momentum at this scale becomes a danger. If the block began sliding down a slope, it would not glide gently. It would accelerate rapidly, becoming a runaway mass capable of crushing everything in its path. Controlling that movement would require a system able to harness immense kinetic energy. No evidence of such a system exists. And yet, the stones were not only moved, they were moved safely. They were positioned. They were aligned. They were placed so precisely that their seams are nearly invisible, even under close inspection. The builders did not simply drag the stones across the ground like primitive laborers. They controlled them. They guided them. They manipulated them with a mastery that contradicts the limitations imposed by friction. To understand this mastery, we must consider the possibility of techniques that are lost to history. These techniques do not need to be fantastical. They could be based on principles we understand today. For example, force distribution. If the builders found a way to expand the contact area beneath the stone, pressure would decrease. If pressure decreases, friction decreases. But creating a platform capable of supporting thousands of tons uniformly would require a material stronger than wood. Stone plates would still grind. Clay would deform. Earth would buckle. Only an engineered surface, one that spreads weight evenly and withstands crushing force, could serve this purpose. Another possibility involves reducing friction, not by lubrication, but by isolation. If the stone could be slightly lifted, even by a few millimeters, the contact force would decrease dramatically. In modern times, we use air cushions or hydraulic lifts to achieve this. But the ancient builders did not have such devices. Unless they possessed a method of mechanical isolation, using an unknown combination of materials or structural leverage, lifting even a small portion of the block would have been impossible. Let us explore leverage itself. A lever multiplies force, but only to the extent that the fulcrum and beam allow. A long wooden beam can lift heavy loads, but under extreme pressure, the beam snaps. The longer the lever, the greater the bending moment, and the more likely it is to fail. Even the hardest ancient woods would break under the loads required at Baalbek. This eliminates simple lever systems from the range of possibilities. One might argue that the builders moved the stones by carving channels beneath them, creating a track. But to move a stone inside a channel, one must still overcome friction. The track would have to be perfectly shaped. The channel walls would have to support lateral pressure. Even then, movement would be painfully slow and extremely dangerous. And again, we would expect to see evidence of such channels carved into the landscape. But none exist. This leads us to a deeper and more unsettling question. What if the builders did not move the stones in the way we imagine? What if the stones were not dragged across the ground? What if they were positioned before the surrounding limestone was fully hardened? This idea touches on theories of geopolymerization or ancient stone softening, but such theories lack direct evidence. The limestone at Baalbek is natural. It was quarried. It was carved. There is no sign of synthetic modification. The stones were not molded. They were cut. And so we return to friction, the fundamental obstacle. After surveying every conventional method, after considering ramps, rollers, lubrication, levers, cranes, and tracks, the problem remains. None of these solutions reduce friction enough to move the stones with the materials available in antiquity, and none explain the precision with which the stones were placed. This tension creates the central paradox. The stones should not have been movable, and yet they were moved. The friction should have been insurmountable, and yet it was overcome. The limits of ancient engineering should have been reached, and yet they were surpassed. Standing before the foundation of Baalbek, one is faced with a structure that embodies this contradiction. The stones rest quietly, as if unaware of the physics they defy. They sit in perfect alignment, unmoved by time, earthquakes, or erosion. They suggest a level of engineering sophistication that exceeds the expectations of ancient history. To acknowledge this paradox is not to surrender to fantasy. It is to recognize that our knowledge of the past is incomplete. The physics is clear. The friction is real. The task is beyond conventional methods. Yet the stones stand as proof that someone at some point understood a solution lost to us. In this sense, Baalbek becomes not only a mystery of construction, but a reminder of human ambition. It shows that even when obstacles appear immovable, someone will attempt to move them. Someone will look at a mountain of stone and refuse to accept that it cannot be shaped. Someone will see friction not as a barrier, but as a challenge. The immense obstacle is not merely the physics of friction. It is our struggle to understand how ancient hands overcame a force that still challenges modern machines. It is the silence between the stones. It is the evidence of an achievement without an explanation. And so, with the weight of this impossibility resting in our thoughts, we continue deeper into the investigation. If friction is the first contradiction, stratigraphy will be the second. The stones themselves will speak, and the layers of Baalbek will reveal the story carved into their foundations. To begin the forensic hunt for echoes, we must treat the entire site of Baalbek as something far more complex than a ruin. It is not a single monument. It is not a unified creation. It is a stack of histories layered on top of one another, each one speaking with a different voice. The only way to understand what happened here is to read the structure the same way a geologist reads the layers of a cliff. Stone has memory. Stone keeps secrets. Stone preserves the hands that shaped it long after the civilizations behind those hands have disappeared. Imagine approaching the Temple of Jupiter, not as a tourist, but as an investigator. You stand before a wall that at first glance seems continuous and coherent, but as you let your eyes adjust to the scale, the differences begin to appear. The stones at the top of the structure, placed during the Roman imperial era, are refined and decorative. They belong to a world that loved ornament, proportion, and symmetry. These are stones that tell you who carved them. They belong to masons who signed their work with style. But as your gaze moves downward, the character of the structure changes. The stones become plainer. They become smoother. They stop telling stories in decoration and begin speaking in mass. At the base of the platform, you encounter stones that no culture takes credit for. They sit there silent, enormous, and older than anything above them. This is the stratigraphy of Baalbek, an upper world carved by Rome, and a lower world carved by someone else entirely. To make sense of this, you must picture the whole platform as a layer cake of human ambition. Each generation added its piece. The Romans built temples to Jupiter, Venus, and Bacchus. Before them, local cultures built altars and sanctuaries. Before those sanctuaries, someone built foundations so massive that later civilizations could only look at them in awe. They treated the stones the way we treat mountains. They did not challenge their size or attempt to understand the techniques that placed them. They simply built above them because the base was already there, ready to support everything that came later. This is what makes Baalbek such a strange archaeological site. Normally, history becomes more primitive as you move backward in time. We expect finesse and precision to appear toward the present, not the past. But in Baalbek, the opposite is true. As you descend the layers, you move from the artistic to the overwhelming, from craftsmanship to impossible engineering. The base of the structure feels like it does not belong to the same story. It feels like a chapter from a different book, inserted into the middle of a Roman narrative. Look closer at the stones themselves. The Roman blocks in the upper courses are large, but they are still manageable. They weigh a few tons each, maybe tens at most. Their joints are visible. Their surfaces are carved with motifs and patterns typical of imperial architecture. These are the stones that belong to the empire we know, the empire that left behind libraries of inscriptions describing its feats. Now look at the stones below them. These are not carved to be beautiful. They are carved to be perfect in shape and staggering in scale. Some weigh 400 tons. Some weigh 800. A few in the quarry nearby weigh more than 1,000. Their precision is not artistic, but geometric. They align with each other in ways that defy the idea of trial and error. The gaps between them are so tight that it is hard to understand how such mass could be manipulated with that degree of control. When you stand before this lower layer, something in your mind begins to resist the explanation that the same people who carved ornate capitals and fluted columns also carved and moved these titans. The styles do not match. The engineering philosophy does not match. The purpose does not match. The upper layers are temples. The lower layer is a foundation unlike any other, a foundation built with a seriousness that borders on obsession. This is why archaeologists describe Baalbek as a palimpsest, a manuscript written over many times, with faint traces of earlier stories bleeding through the newer ones. The Romans did not erase what came before. They simply built on it, because the scale of the earlier work was beyond anything they could challenge. The earlier builders did not just shape stone. They shaped the very landscape. They altered the terrain in ways that would have required knowledge of geometry, logistics, and physics that do not fit into any known timeline for the region. Think of the site as a conversation across millennia. The Romans speak clearly. Their voice is documented, loud and confident. The earlier builders speak in whispers through the weight of the stones. They left no inscriptions, no reliefs, no mythology that explicitly claims the work. Their language is mass, precision, and silence. And silence, in archaeology, is one of the most unsettling forms of evidence. When something should have been recorded, but is not, the absence becomes a clue. This first step in the forensic analysis is crucial. Before we look at the Trilithon, before we examine erosion patterns, before we return to the quarry, we must understand this basic principle. Baalbek is not a temple. It is not a ruin. It is a vertical timeline built in stone. And the deeper you look, the older and more mysterious the engineering becomes. The stratigraphy teaches us something essential. The temple is an evolution, but the foundation is an anomaly. The Romans built a masterpiece of religion and art. Someone before them built a masterpiece of physics and endurance. To investigate the mystery of Baalbek, we must treat the stones as layers of time and let each one tell its part of the story. Walk with me to the western retaining wall of the platform. At first, it appears to be another massive stretch of stone, impressive but familiar, similar to other large-scale constructions in the ancient world. But as you approach, something begins to change. Your sense of proportion shifts. Your eyes start to measure the blocks, not in inches or feet, but in body lengths. And then you see them. 3 stones aligned in a perfect horizontal row, sitting 20 feet above the ground, each one so large that the mind hesitates to classify them as building materials at all. These are the stones known as the Trilithon. 3 blocks of limestone, each one weighing more than 800 tons. Not at ground level, not lying in a quarry waiting to be shaped, not resting where gravity dropped them. They are elevated, placed deliberately, locked into position with a precision that feels incompatible with the numbers behind their mass. This is not a case of accidental survival or natural placement. Someone lifted these giants. Someone adjusted them. Someone fitted them together into a seamless facade geometry and intent. Stand beneath them and look upward. Your body tries to understand what it is seeing. A single block is longer than a city bus, taller than 2 men stacked, and heavier than a fully loaded Boeing 747. And there are 3 of them, side by side, forming a single course in the wall. The effect is unsettling. It is like standing beneath a mountain range that someone decided to carve into modular pieces. Most ancient structures use stones scaled to human labor. 100 men can push a 1-ton block. A team of specialists can raise a 2-ton lintel. Even the grandest monuments tend to rely on numbers just beyond human capability. But the Trilithon breaks this rule. It does not scale up human engineering. It ignores it entirely. These stones belong to a category that does not consider manpower or leverage or traditional physics. They are stones that treat weight not as a problem, but as a preference. And there is another layer to the strangeness. The Trilithon is not at the center of the temple. It is not a ceremonial altar or a symbolic architectural flourish. It is not meant to be seen in the way a statue or column is seen. It sits in the back of the complex, part of a retaining wall whose only purpose is structural stability. Whoever built this did not reserve the largest stones for decoration or religious meaning. They placed them in a location that is practical, functional, and almost hidden. This decision reveals a mindset very different from the Roman one. It suggests a culture that defined engineering not by beauty or symbolism, but by endurance and permanence. As you stand before the Trilithon, one question rises above all others. Why would anyone choose to build with stones this large when smaller stones would have achieved the same structural purpose? The wall did not need to be built this way, yet it was. And that choice is the first clue that the builders possessed a technological philosophy that has no parallel in the known ancient world. Approach the Trilithon from the side and look closely at the joints where the stones meet. From a distance, the seams are nearly invisible. As you step closer, you begin to search for the imperfections that should be there. 3 blocks of this scale should reveal some sign of struggle. A misalignment, a settling crack, a slight deviation caused by gravity, weather, or time. Yet none of these expected flaws appear. The surfaces fit so tightly that even the thinnest blade could not slip between them. This level of precision is already impressive when achieved with stones weighing 1 or 2 tons. Achieving it with stones that weigh 800 tons requires an entirely different category of engineering. The precision is not ornamental. It is structural, intentional, and mathematically perfect. To align 3 giants this large without mortise joints, metal clamps, or binding mortar requires full control over their shape and position at every stage of construction. Ancient masons could achieve remarkable accuracy, but accuracy at this scale is something else. When a stone is this massive, even a single millimeter of error becomes a physical force. A misalignment does not simply look wrong. It becomes an immovable obstacle that no number of workers can correct. The only way to fit the Trilithon the way it is fitted is to shape each block with such uniformity that the result behaves as if it were a single carved mass. You are witnessing something that feels closer to industrial machining than hand carving. Another mystery emerges when you analyze the choice of material. Limestone is abundant in the region, but the density of these particular stones is unusually high. They were not selected at random. They were quarried from a specific section of the mountain where the stone is stronger, more uniform, and more resistant to erosion. The quarry itself is located downhill from the temple platform, which means the blocks were not only lifted into place, but transported uphill. This single detail overturns every conventional reconstruction. Moving 800 tons uphill requires energy and precision that exceed what ropes and sledges can reliably deliver. The Romans were brilliant engineers, yet they left no mention of this achievement. Their surviving texts describe the transport of obelisks, the erection of columns, and the construction of amphitheaters. When they encountered difficulty, they wrote about it openly, often elaborating on the methods and equipment used. But here, the silence is complete. No reference, no diagram, no celebration, no record at all. This absence is not historical coincidence. It is evidence of mismatch. The Romans documented what they built. Their silence suggests they did not build this. The design choice becomes even more perplexing when you ask why 3 stones were used instead of many smaller ones. If structural stability was the goal, dozens of manageable blocks could have achieved the same effect with far less risk. Instead, the builders took the opposite approach. They chose the most difficult option possible and executed it flawlessly. This deliberate escalation of difficulty reveals a mindset fundamentally different from the Roman approach. It implies a culture or a tradition that understood weight as a form of strength, not a limitation. For them, mass was not an obstacle. It was a design principle. Step back once more and let your eyes rest on the entire western wall. The Trilithon does not stand alone. Beneath the three giants lies another row of stones, each one weighing roughly 400 tons. Beneath those, another row of 200-ton stones. There is a hierarchy of mass embedded into the structure, like a gravitational pyramid. The farther down you go, the heavier the blocks become. The closer you get to the core of the platform, the more the architecture expresses a single idea: stability through immensity. Nothing about this arrangement is accidental. It reflects a level of engineering thought that goes beyond the practical demands of a temple. A structure that uses the largest stones at its highest point of leverage. Because remember, the Trilithon is 20 feet above the ground, defies basic economic logic. Moving a 200-ton block is a monumental effort. Moving an 800-ton block is a project that tests the limits of material science. Lifting that block and placing it precisely above other blocks is something else entirely. So why do it? Why choose this configuration instead of the far simpler, far safer, far more conventional method of using many smaller stones? The answer cannot be religious symbolism. These blocks are hidden behind layers of later construction. They are not decorated. They do not carry inscriptions. No ceremonial purpose has ever been attached to them. They are purely structural, which means the only reason to use blocks this large is because the builders believed large blocks performed better. This brings us to the central puzzle. What kind of engineering worldview treats enormous weight as an advantage instead of a problem? What kind of tradition intentionally seeks out stones that weigh hundreds of tons, even when smaller ones would do? This decision reflects a technological confidence that seems incompatible with the civilizations we know in this region during the time frame suggested. The builder's mindset appears to be guided by a different relationship with time. Large stones resist earthquakes better than small ones. They do not shift easily. They distribute force uniformly. They take millennia to erode. In other words, a wall built from these stones is not meant to last a century. It is meant to last an epoch. And in Baalbek, this philosophy succeeded. The Roman temple that once stood on top of the platform collapsed long ago, destroyed by earthquakes and invasions. But the Trilithon remained unmoved. Its alignment did not shift. The joints did not loosen. The stones did not crack. They endured everything that history threw at them. When you see this contrast, something becomes clear. The base of the temple is not Roman. It does not share the Roman signature. Roman engineering is elegant, efficient, optimized. The Trilithon is none of those things. It is excessive, audacious, and monumental to the point of absurdity. It represents a form of construction that does not scale up from smaller traditions, but begins at the highest possible threshold of difficulty. It is architecture that treats the impossible as the starting point. The Trilithon tells us that the foundation of Baalbek is older than the temple above it, built by a culture that did not fear mass, did not fear physics, and did not fear the impossible. And whoever they were, their signature remains carved in stone, preserved by the sheer weight of their ambition. Walk around the base of the platform and let your hand rest on the surface of the lowest stones. The first thing you notice is how smooth they are. Not smooth from polishing, but smooth from age. The edges are rounded, the corners softened. The surface is worn by a span of time, so long that weather has erased the original texture. These stones look ancient in a way that feels almost geological. They resemble cliffs or exposed bedrock more than carved masonry. Now lift your eyes to the stones above them, the Roman layers. These blocks are smaller, neatly cut, decorated with carved moldings and classical motifs. They have sharp corners, straight edges, and visible tool marks. Even after centuries of exposure, much of their detail remains. You can still see the ornamental grooves and patterns. They are weathered, yes, but they are clearly much younger. This difference hits you instantly. The Roman stones look old. The base stones look primordial. If you could remove the temple and leave only the foundation, you would not guess that the two layers were part of the same architectural project. They do not share craft, scale, erosion depth, or aesthetic intention. They do not even seem to share the same relationship with time. The Roman blocks reflect a civilization that built for grandeur, ceremony, and political glory. The megalithic base reflects something else entirely: permanence for its own sake. Erosion becomes a silent but persuasive witness here. Weather does not treat all stones equally. The rate of decay depends on the type of stone, the environment, and most importantly, the duration. The megalithic blocks at Baalbek show significantly deeper erosion patterns than the stones laid by the Romans. These lower blocks have endured more cycles of rain, wind, frost, heat, and seismic shaking. They have lived through more centuries than their Roman counterparts. If the Romans had built the entire platform, all layers would show a similar degree of erosion. Instead, the lower stones look as if they have survived epochs. Their surfaces have a patina that only vast time can create. They do not match the Roman layers because they do not belong to the Roman layers. This is not a small difference. It is a gulf, a geological gap wrapped in architecture. Look closely where the two building styles meet. The Romans did not bother to match their stones to the contours of the megalithic surface. Instead, they built directly on top of it, adapting their own blocks to its shape. This is exactly what a later culture does when encountering an older foundation. They use what is there, because removing it would be impossible. This interface, this boundary between two eras, is one of the most compelling clues in the entire site. The Romans treated the base not as something they made, but as something they inherited. And the base itself looks like it had already stood for centuries, perhaps millennia, before they arrived. Look closer still, and you will notice something that changes the conversation entirely. Correction marks. Small chisel scars interrupted by tiny pauses, shallow grooves where a craftsman retraced a line, microscopic stepbacks where a corner was refined a fraction of an inch. These are not random tool marks left by hurried workmen. They are the traces of deliberate calibration. Such corrections should not be remarkable in ordinary masonry. But at Baalbek, they are different in kind. They indicate a process of iterative shaping, measurement, and verification performed at a scale rarely associated with ancient hand-hewn stone. Each adjustment implies a standard, a tolerance, and a method for checking it. Someone here cared about millimeters, not only about mass. The presence of these marks suggests practiced teams of specialists, not ad hoc labor gangs. Now place that observation next to the erosion evidence. The lower stones show centuries of weathering, yet someone invested precious time to retouch and refine their joints. Why would a culture repeatedly correct blocks that already demonstrated enormous longevity? One answer emerges. These stones were not merely placed and left. They were tuned to interact with other blocks in a mechanical system that demanded precision. The corrections are a clue that the builders expected the stones to function together with exact fitting, as if the wall were a machine composed of carved parts, not just stacked rock. This idea reframes the lower courses of Baalbek. They are no longer simply massive. They are engineered. They are both brute and refined. The base resists erosion because it was crafted to resist movement, to interlock with itself so thoroughly that time, earthquakes, and human violence could not pry it apart. The correction marks are the fingerprints of that engineering impulse. There is also another pattern hidden in the weathering, differential pitting and smoothing within the same block. Certain faces show deep scalloping from wind and rain, while adjacent surfaces remain comparatively sharp. This implies differences in exposure and possibly in original finishing technique. It suggests that some faces were intentionally protected or oriented, while others were left to bear the elements. That orientation could reflect an original plan in which certain sides were functional, meant to lock with neighboring stones, and others were external, meant to endure. All of this has consequences for how we interpret the site. The Romans treated the platform as a ready-made stage. They did not attempt to modify the base extensively. They accepted its size and geometry and adapted their ornamental architecture to it. That behavior is consistent with encountering a pre-existing system that already satisfied the fundamental demands of load-bearing and permanence. Why expend resources to remake what already works perfectly? The correction marks, the deep patina, and the selective erosion together form a coherent message. They tell of builders who combined mass with measurement. They show a tradition that understood fit as well as force. They hint at techniques that allowed astonishing precision on gigantic blocks long before industrial tooling existed. Reading these marks changes the problem. The question is no longer only how these stones were moved. It becomes how they were shaped, tuned, and assembled to behave like parts in a vast, immovable machine. Step back, not physically, but conceptually, and the pieces begin to align into a larger pattern. The erosion, the correction marks, the inexplicable effort poured into surfaces that no visitor was meant to admire. These are not the behaviors of a culture building for spectacle. They are the behaviors of a culture building for function. And therein lies the tension at the heart of Baalbek's lower platform. The Romans who arrived here were obsessed with aesthetics, proportionality, and display. They carved Corinthian capitals with drilling techniques so delicate that the shadow inside a single acanthus leaf still looks soft 2,000 years later. Their identity was architecture as theater. Yet at Baalbek, they stand atop a foundation that is the opposite of theater, a foundation optimized for endurance, not beauty. This mismatch of values is revealing. The Romans did not replicate the lower style anywhere else in their empire, even though they had every reason to do so if it were merely primitive megalithism. If these techniques were so simple, so compatible with their worldview, we would see copycat foundations across the Levant, across North Africa, across Europe. We do not. The style appears fully matured at Baalbek, and then vanishes. That is the fingerprint of a tradition that was inherited, not invented. But inherited from whom? Here, the geology speaks almost louder than the archaeology. The weathering on the most ancient blocks is not uniform. It reflects periods of exposure, punctuated by periods of burial or partial coverage. You see protected zones where surfaces meet precisely, almost hermetically, and rougher zones where the elements penetrated more freely. This suggests that the lowest layer may have once been part of the structure with a different configuration than the Roman temple above it. A structure that enclosed some blocks more tightly, shielding them. A structure now gone. And the implications are enormous. If the earliest builders erected an arrangement different from the Roman one, they were not building a prototemple. They were constructing something whose internal geometry mattered. Something that relied on precision, fitting as much as on sheer size. A substructure engineered, not for worship, but for stability, vibration control, or load distribution according to a plan the Romans later overwrote, literally without understanding. This is where the erosion pattern becomes critical rather than cosmetic. It offers a glimpse of the original logic of the site, a logic the Romans superseded but could not erase because the stones themselves carry the memory. What emerges is not a story of a monolithic empire imposing order on a blank slate. It is the story of one architectural tradition built atop the fossil of another, a palimpsest of attitudes toward stone. The Romans wanted columns to impress the eye. Their predecessors wanted foundations that could outlive the sky. And as we examine the lower blocks, those impossibly straight seams, that tenacious patina, those maddeningly thoughtful corrections, we begin to understand that the deeper mystery of Baalbek is not merely how big the stones are. It is why they were made that way. Stand a little farther back now enough to see both blocks at once. The 1,000-ton giant on the surface and the 1,650-ton behemoth half buried beneath it. Together, they form a tableau that should not exist. A quarry, by definition, is a place of efficiency. Stone is cut in manageable sizes, in volumes that match the needs of a building project, using a rhythm and sequence perfected by generations of laborers. Everything in a quarry has a logic: remove material, reduce weight, prepare pieces for transport. But here, the logic breaks. These two stones defy the entire purpose of quarrying. They are too big to transport, too big to rotate, too big even to lift with the greatest cranes of the modern world. And yet they were shaped with the calm, methodical confidence of workers who did not see these dimensions as obstacles. No panic marks, no improvisation, no signs of testing boundaries, only execution. If you kneel by the lower block dust soft under your palms, you'll all notice an edge carved so straight it looks as if it was sliced by a machine, not chipped, not fractured, sliced. The geometry almost mocks you, like a silent riddle etched into limestone. Then comes the second shock, the positioning. The 1,000-ton stone is aligned precisely along the same axis as the larger one below, as if they were part of a sequence like steps in a process. A conveyor of megaliths. A production line scaled to a level that doesn't belong in antiquity. And here is where the forensic details become disturbing. The underside of the 1,000-ton block is finished. This alone is an engineering paradox. Why finish the face that would never be visible? Why shape a surface that would sit against the platform, hidden forever? Unless the builders needed it to move, to slide, to roll on something we no longer understand. Between the two megastones, there is a precise clearance, an engineered gap, not a naturally fractured separation. It is the kind of allowance you give when you plan to insert tools, supports, or lifting mechanisms. Imagine leaving room beneath a refrigerator so you can slide a dolly underneath. Except here, the refrigerator weighs more than a nuclear submarine. Nothing about these stones reflects Roman technique. No wedge patterns, no chisel signatures, no plug and feather scars. The Romans left graffiti carved into marble, notes on construction, guidelines scratched into stone faces. They were a civilization of documentation. Even their mistakes were catalogued. But here, silence, no Latin, no marks, no revisions. As if the culture that carved these giants existed outside the Roman world entirely, or centuries before it. And so we face a contradiction sharper than the carved edges themselves. If these stones were impossible for the Romans, and too precise for any later quarrying attempt, then who began this sequence of giants? And why did they stop only after preparing an even bigger block? The abandoned monsters do not represent failure. They represent a story cut mid-sentence. Now take a moment to imagine the quarry not as we see it today, still, silent, half buried by time, but alive. Hundreds of workers moving in a disciplined rhythm. Stone dust rising in soft, pale clouds. Foremen shouting orders through cupped hands. The distant clang of metal on limestone echoing across the valley. This place was not quiet. It was not abandoned. It was once the humming heart of something enormous. And then, one day, that hum stopped. Not gradually, not in a slow decline. Suddenly. The most telling clue is the tool scatter pattern found near the edges of the quarry. Archaeologists rarely talk about it publicly because it doesn't fit comfortably into the standard explanation. But the evidence is there. Tools left mid-task, half-carved channels that end abruptly, smoothing passes that stop in the middle of a sweep. It is the archaeological signature of interruption, not abandonment. People left in haste or were forced to stop abruptly. But what could halt the construction of stones on such an impossible scale? Not technical limitation. They were already beyond that. Not resource failure, the valley was still rich. Not Roman conquest, the timelines don't match. Not earthquake, the geology shows no disruption at the quarry layer. The reason remains unknown. And that is what makes the site so haunting. Because the pattern repeats elsewhere in the ancient world. The unfinished obelisk of Aswan, the abandoned monoliths of Yangshan, the half-dressed stones of Pima Punku, the deserted drilling pits of Tiwanaku, each site shows the same signature. A moment where ambition was greater than the civilization that inherited the tools. But Baalbek's quarry stands apart, because here, the ambition wasn't halted at its limit. It was halted while scaling up. Stopping a 100-ton experiment is understandable. Stopping a 1,000-ton project suggests catastrophe. But stopping after beginning a 1,650-ton monolith? That suggests something far stranger. Whatever they were building was unfinished, yes, but not because it failed, because something else ended. Think of it this way. You don't begin carving the largest stone ever attempted by human hands unless you are absolutely certain you know what to do with it. You don't choose a 1,650-ton block unless you already possess the tools, the techniques, and the confidence to exploit it. So the real mystery isn't the stones themselves, it's the absence that surrounds them. A vanished plan, a missing technology, a civilization whose ambitions were larger than the world we assume existed. And the silence of the quarry, once alive with mechanical purpose, becomes the quiet testimony of that lost capacity. When you stand between the two abandoned giants, their shadow falls over you like the presence of a forgotten era. Not an era of myth, but of mastery. A mastery that ended not because it was impossible, but because its keepers disappeared. In the museums of Rome, under controlled light and behind protective glass, you can find the records of Roman engineering displayed almost like trophies. There are reliefs showing cranes, rope systems, pulleys, cantilever beams, counterweights, and scaffolding frames. There are written manuals that describe, in matter-of-fact detail, the logistics of moving heavy loads. The Romans were not only engineers, they were chroniclers of engineering. They documented their struggles, their triumphs, and even their mundane procedures. Nothing about their infrastructural achievements was treated as a secret. They wanted the world to know what they were capable of. This is why the Lateran obelisk stands out as a perfect anchor point in reality. It is not only a monument, it is a report card. It is the heaviest object the Romans ever moved with full, surviving documentation. A monolith originally quarried in Egypt, weighing around 300 to 400 tons. Today, we look at it as a decorative spike near the Basilica of St. John Lateran. But in antiquity, it was an engineering ordeal of such magnitude that scribes recorded the entire undertaking. They described the ships needed to transport it. They described the manpower required. They even described the setbacks, the failures, the moments when ropes snapped or pulleys jammed. They recorded the struggle. And despite the grandeur of the empire, despite its unlimited labor force, its wealth, and its mastery of mechanical advantage, the operation pushed them to the brink. This is not speculation. It is carved into stone reliefs and preserved in written accounts. Moving a 300-ton object was a national project worthy of historical record. It required ingenuity, improvisation, and arguably a degree of desperation. This is the real measurable limit of Roman engineering, a limit whose existence is confirmed by the Romans themselves. Now take that confirmed ceiling of capability and compare it with the base of Baalbek. Not 300 tons, not 400, but between 800 and 1,200 tons for the placed foundation blocks, and a staggering 1,650 tons for the unfinished monolith left in the quarry. The gap between these two realities is not incremental. It is not a matter of adjustment. It is a gulf. A chasm in scale so wide that it changes the entire nature of the problem. Because increasing weight is not like increasing length or width. You can double a building's height with proportionally more materials. You can increase a bridge's span by adding thicker beams, but weight is exponential. Forces compound, friction grows. Stress increases faster than the resources needed to control it. You cannot treat 1,000 tons the way you treat 300. The physics becomes hostile. Every method you rely on snaps, crushes, collapses, or sinks under the load. That is why invoking Roman engineering here is not a satisfying answer. It is like suggesting that because a person can lift a suitcase, they can lift a car simply by trying harder. It ignores the changing rules of the physical world, and the Romans knew their limits. They wrote about them. They boasted about their victories, precisely because those victories were rare. If they had ever moved 1,000-ton block, let alone multiple 1,000-ton blocks, it would not be silent. It would be celebrated. It would be carved into triumphal arches. It would appear in military diaries, in engineering treatises, in stone reliefs showing proud laborers standing beside the impossible. Instead, there is not a single Roman text that claims responsibility for moving the Trilithon blocks of Baalbek. Not one line describing the technique, not one illustration, not one hint. The silence is too loud to ignore. And this is where the reality anchors the mystery. The Romans were masters of what they knew. But what lies at the base of Baalbek seems to belong to a knowledge that predated them, a capability that they inherited but did not possess. They built on top of something older, something crafted by hands that understood weight in a way we no longer do. And when we compare the documented struggle of the Lateran obelisk to the effortless placement implied at Baalbek, we are left with a contradiction so sharp it almost cuts the mind. The Romans were great engineers, but they were not these engineers. The stones at the base do not match their limits. They exceed them by an order of magnitude, and the world that could move those stones no longer exists. The story of the Thunderstone is often told as a tale of triumph, a moment when political will, artistic ambition, and engineering ingenuity fused into a single monumental act. But to understand Baalbek, to truly understand the magnitude of what was achieved in the mountains of Lebanon, we must revisit this story not as a celebration of human achievement, but as a reminder of our limits. Picture the scene. A marshy field outside St. Petersburg. The air is cold enough that each breath rises in a pale plume. Workers stand in heavy coats, their boots sinking into the soft ground. The stone they are preparing to move is grotesquely large, an ancient boulder that predates every kingdom and empire that ever touched the region. It is not elegant like an obelisk. It is not a carved monument. It is nature's own creation, torn from the earth by geological violence, long before the first humans wandered these lands. The sculptor Falconet insisted that this raw, unshaped chunk of earth would become the pedestal for Peter the Great. The stone would symbolize immovable strength, permanence, and the mythic foundation of Russia itself. Catherine the Great approved the idea without a moment of hesitation. She wanted a monument that no European power could ignore. But her court engineers knew that they were standing before a nightmare. 1,200 tons of jagged granite, no flat sides, no carved surfaces to distribute pressure, no regular dimensions. It was an engineering problem without precedent in modern history. And so they invented something new, a system of bronze spheres functioning as bearings, arranged under a custom-built track made of reinforced beams. This was not a small innovation. It was a breakthrough so significant that its principles would one day be echoed in modern mechanical engineering. The workers began their task by digging trenches, reinforcing the ground, preparing long straights of track, and positioning the metal bearings one by one. Each bearing had to be perfectly aligned. Each groove had to be polished and lubricated. Even a slight deviation risked catastrophic collapse. When the stone finally moved, it did not glide. It groaned. The earth groaned with it. The metal bearings squealed under the pressure. Workers strained against it, hundreds of them pushing in unison. Commanders shouted orders. Others used levers to correct the stone's direction whenever the boulder shifted dangerously. It took a full day to move it a few meters. At night, torches flickered in the cold air, while workers slept wrapped in blankets beside the great mass, knowing that if it shifted unexpectedly, it could crush an entire camp. And yet, despite every hazard, the task continued for months. There were injuries. There were collapses. There were moments when the boulder nearly sank into the mud, threatening to destroy the newly invented transport system entirely. It was an act of persistence, so intense that it became part of Russia's national mythology. But here is the point that matters. This was the 18th century, the age of steel tools, the age of metallurgy, the age of measured geometry, the age of precision drafting, the age of scientific academies and specialized engineers. And still, the Thunderstone almost defeated them. Now return to Baalbek. Not a marshy field, not a gentle slope, not a local transport effort, a mountain platform, a highland construction site, a retaining wall 20 feet above ground level. The foundational stones of Baalbek were cut with accurate angles, shaped with vast, flat surfaces, placed in alignment with neighboring blocks, lifted into a wall, joined so perfectly that no light passes between them. The Thunderstone was dragged. The Baalbek stones were engineered. The Thunderstone was placed. The Baalbek stones were installed. The Thunderstone was a symbol. The Baalbek stones were structural. And the most disturbing discrepancy of all is this. The Thunderstone was celebrated, chronicled, witnessed, recorded, immortalized by writers, diplomats, engineers, and the press. An empire wanted the world to know it had moved something enormous. But the megaliths of Baalbek? No empire claimed them. No engineer described them. No ancient historian explained them. They exist without a story, as though the very act of moving them was too normal for their creators to bother documenting. And yet, these same stones surpass the Thunderstone not only in weight, but in complexity. Imagine trying to place the Thunderstone into a wall 20 feet above ground without cracking it, without damaging the wall, and without tilting it by even a fraction of a degree. In 18th century Russia, such a feat would not have been difficult. It would have been impossible. Even today, modern engineers debate how they would replicate Baalbek's placement of the Trilithon blocks. The cranes we use are not designed for such awkward, uneven loads. The risk of catastrophic failure is immense. And lifting an object that massive without damaging its adjacent structures requires a level of control we generally only achieve through high-tech hydraulic systems. Meanwhile, the Baalbek stones display no signs of crude placement, no cracks, no impact scars, no deformation marks. They were positioned gently, confidently, with a mastery that feels disturbingly familiar in its precision modern, almost mechanized, and yet belongs to an era far older than any metal-bearing transport system. During the Thunderstone's journey, artists sketched it, historians documented it, foreign observers marveled at it, poets used it as metaphor, Catherine herself wrote about it. There is more historical record surrounding that one stone than around entire centuries of ancient engineering. And yet, when it comes to Baalbek, we have silence. Deep, total, impenetrable silence. It is as if the people who placed those stones did not consider the act extraordinary. And that is precisely what makes it extraordinary. Because to move something so massive and remain silent about it suggests one of two possibilities. Either the builders were so accustomed to dealing with immense stones that the act did not impress them, or the builders were not the ones who wrote the histories that survived. Both options are uncomfortable. Both challenge our assumptions. Both expand the scope of the mystery. The Thunderstone teaches us not how capable humanity is, but how incapable we often are when confronted with raw scale. It shows us the limit of muscle, of rope, of roller, of lever, of ingenuity. It shows us the edge of our achievable horizon. and Baalbek stands far beyond that horizon. When we place these two efforts side by side, not as myths, but as engineering events, the contrast is breathtaking. One is the pinnacle of Enlightenment-era effort. The other is a foundation block casually integrated into a construction site thousands of years earlier. One strained an empire. The other strained nothing at all. One required invention. The other leaves us wondering whether we have forgotten something once known. The Thunderstone humbles us. Baalbek frightens us. There, as a moment somewhere between the data and the dust, when all the questions about ancient technology stop being about the past and start becoming about us. It happens slowly at first. You're reading excavation reports, scanning through drone footage, replaying slow-motion stabilization passes of inscriptions that have been eroded almost to nothing. And then, unexpectedly, you realize there's something underneath all of it, something that has nothing to do with chisels, quarries, alloys, or tools. It is the sense that we are looking at a mirror. Because the more we understand the engineering behind these monuments, the clearer it becomes that the true mystery is not the methods, but the mindset. Not the chiseling, but the choosing. Not the physics, but the insistence. Every culture we examine, whether it is dragging trilithons, carving ultra-precise tune shafts, pouring geopolymers, or forging astronomical instruments, reveals a capacity for endurance and organization that feels strangely incompatible with our modern expectations about ancient people. It isn't that they were more advanced than we think. It is that they were more committed than we dare imagine. This is the turning point for every researcher who stays long enough in the dust, the moment you realize that the ancients didn't to create impossible things because they had supernatural help, but because they had a worldview in which impossibility wasn't a useful category. When a task felt aligned with meaning, they simply did it, no matter how long it took, how heavy it was, or how absurd it looked to future eyes. And that is when the modern mind cracks a little. Because we live in a world where the logic of efficiency reigns, where the value of something is measured by how fast it can be done, how cheaply it can be replicated, how well it scales. But the ancients lived in a world where the value of something was measured by the depth of its significance, even if it demanded centuries of labor, astronomical resources, or generational coordination. That is the real dissonance. Not the stones, not the mechanisms, not the alignments. The worldview. You feel it most intensely when you follow archaeologists on their slow, methodical walks through sites at dawn, when the light is low enough to reveal chisel patterns, wind erosion, and the faint lines of leveling that are invisible at noon. These are the moments when the physical and the philosophical collapse into each other. You touch a cut that took 50 men 2 months to make, and you try to imagine a culture where that wasn't considered extraordinary. And you can't, because your world doesn't prepare you for that scale of patience. When you sit with that feeling long enough, you start to wonder, what else have we misplaced? What parts of human potential lie dormant, simply because our society never asks them to wake? This is where the anchor in reality becomes less about confirming the basics of engineering and more about interrogating the assumptions we carry about human nature. Because if people with limited metallurgy, limited leverage systems, and no global communication could nonetheless coordinate monumental architecture with millimeter accuracy, what does that say about what humans are capable of when meaning drives action? The deeper you go, the more uncomfortable the question becomes. We assume we've progressed. In many ways, we have. But progress is not linear. It's directional, and directions can diverge. We have progressed in efficiency, communication, computation, and automation. The ancients progressed in endurance, alignment, mythic coherence, symbolic systems, and intergenerational fidelity to purpose. They built things that lasted because they weren't building for quarterly cycles, political terms, or individual lifetimes. They built for cosmology, for the alignment of their culture with how they believed the universe was structured. That is the part we struggle to understand, because we don't have anything like that. And when you stand inside the great stone chambers, the acoustics swallowing your breath, the temperature dropping as if you stepped into another epoch, the air still enough to make time feel like a superstition, you sense that our ancestors were not simply solving problems. They were expressing a worldview in stone, in ratios, in alignments, in monuments so enduring that erosion itself becomes a slow translator. Nothing in modern life gives us that feeling. When you return to your hotel room after a day in the field feet coated in dust, memory cards full, laptop glowing in the dark, the feeling doesn't go away. Instead, it sharpens. You look at 3D LiDAR scans, cross-sections of chambers, structural reinforcement models, and photographs from a dozen angles. You annotate features. You document parallels. You organize files. But beneath all of it, something else is happening. You realize you're not trying to understand just the structure. You're trying to understand the will. The will of a culture that could think in centuries. The will of leaders who could mobilize thousands without coercion as the primary engine. The will of artisans who chiseled perfect surfaces in total darkness, because that part of the tomb would never again see light. The will of engineers who built with redundancies that didn't serve immediate function, but served symbolic integrity. The will of people who believed that precision itself was a form of devotion. This is the psychological pivot point that all serious researchers face. The realization that the ancient world wasn't deep primitive, it was different. And that difference is so radical, it destabilizes every simplistic comparison we try to make. And so, slowly, reluctantly, you start to ask the question that every archaeologist, engineer, anthropologist, and philosopher eventually asks. What if the greatest gap between us and the ancients is not knowledge, but courage? Not tools, but purpose? Not ability, but belief? And what if the real reason their monuments still stand is because they built them from the inside out from a worldview, strong enough to survive the collapse of the civilizations that created them? This is where the anchor sinks deepest. Not into the sand, but into the mind. Because once you see the ancient world in that light, nothing about human history looks simple again. And nothing about the present looks inevitable. And it is here, at this intersection of engineering and will, that our community finds its home. If you are searching for a quiet place to unravel these enigmas, not with hype, but with patience, consider subscribing. Join us in the search for the forgotten history of our species. The investigation continues. Imagine the Bekaa Valley before anyone called it by any of the names we use today. No temples crowned the horizon. No Roman columns cast their shadows. The earth lay open, simple and immense, a plain interrupted only by the faint rise of limestone ridges. Now picture on that plain, not a building, but a foundation. A broad, blinding sheet of white stone, level to the eye in a way a natural surface never is. The blocks that create it are not random. They are deliberate in scale and exactitude, arranged like a single mechanism that resists time rather than invites it. This is not a platform built to be admired. It is a surface built to be trusted. Its utility is not obvious at first glance, because it asks a think in units, longer than a human lifetime. The stones are too large to be ornamental, and too precise to be mere rubble. Their seams are so tight that light does not pass between them. Their faces are flattened to tolerances that suggest measurement, not improvisation. Whoever laid them was not interested in speed or spectacle. They were interested in permanence. To read the platform is to read an instruction manual in absence. There are no inscriptions telling us what sat on this bed. There are no reliefs depicting the rituals performed upon it. Instead, the stones speak only through their geometry. Their scale suggests an intent to bear enormous loads evenly, to distribute forces over a surface so vast that local pressure points could not form. The platform resists the idea of collapse, not by ornament, but by arithmetic. It is engineered at a scale where mass becomes structural logic. If the purpose was practical, then the question is simple and frighteningly large. What required such a surface? The first instinct is to imagine structures we know. Temples with dozens of columns, palaces, terraces. But the lack of any central axis, any carved pedestals, any obvious altar suggests a different purpose. The platform's emptiness seems intentional. It frames nothing. It receives everything. It could have supported a superstructure taller than the surrounding hills, a device whose footprint needed absolute geometric stability, or a weight distribution scheme that we cannot reconstruct. It could also have been the machine itself, the foundation integrated into a larger apparatus that folded into the landscape. Consider the engineering implications. To put enormous weight on a surface without fracturing individual blocks, a builder must minimize differential settlement. The stones must settle together so they act as a single composite body. That requires machining or dressing each stone to interfaces that render micro-movements impossible. The megaliths at Baalbek show exactly this quality. They are not merely stacked. They are married. Each joint is a small triumph of contact mechanics. If you imagine the platform as an engineered surface, you must also imagine a workforce skilled not only in carving but in measurement, leveling, and quality control at a scale that implies institutional knowledge and multi-generational practice. Now pull the lens back to the social level. The platform implies organization. It implies specialists and planners. It implies a project that exceeded the capacity of a single generation. To maintain standards across decades, perhaps centuries, a culture needs systems of apprenticeship, record, and authority. The absence of textual records does not mean the absence of process. It means that the process was transmitted by other means, perhaps embodied in craft guilds, in ritualized instruction, or in practical manuals that never survived. The architecture itself is the surviving manual. There is a second layer to consider: seismic resilience. The Bekaa Valley sits within a region prone to earthquakes. Smaller constructions can be repaired. Heavier ones can be rebuilt. But an immovable foundation must be resilient by design. Massive stones at the base reduce the effect of upward and lateral accelerations. Their inertia resists short, violent motions. Their interlocking faces dissipate energy through contact rather than brittle failure. Whoever designed this wanted not only to stand, but to endure every tremor imaginable. That choice demonstrates a long-term horizon, a cultural patience that measured risk in generations rather than in campaigns. Now imagine what it took to prepare the route from quarry to platform. Even if the stones had been moved only a short distance, their size requires transport logistics that transform the landscape into infrastructure. Access roads, reinforced paths, temporary platforms, and staging areas would all be necessary. The quarry itself becomes part of the system, a workshop where stone is tested, cut, and tuned for fit. The half-cut monoliths that remain in the quarry are not evidence of failure so much as evidence of ambition. They show the intention to scale production beyond anything we normally attribute to pre-Roman societies in the region. There is also the matter of choice. Why build a foundation of such magnitude when smaller, faster solutions would have sufficed for most sacred architecture? The answer lies in the builder's horizon. They were not building for a human lifetime. They were building for a geological age. Their priority was not ornament or civic pride. It was endurance. They chose mass because mass outlives ornament. They chose precision because precision outlasts improvisation. In that choice, there is a philosophy: to make something that resists change, that anchors memory to place, that transforms the transient into the durable. But the platform also provokes a humbling question. If their purpose remains unknown, if the superstructure that may have stood on it vanished without trace, then we are left with a design problem whose variables are hidden. We can reverse engineer tolerances and stress paths, but we cannot reconstruct the original loading scenarios. We can test hypotheses about ramps, rollers, and levers, and find them wanting. We can compare the site to other megalithic enterprises and see patterns of scale and technique. But Baalbek's platform remains exceptional in both scope and finish. So we do the only thing left to do. We listen to the stones. We measure seams, map erosion, and catalog tool marks. We look for evidence of temporary fittings that might reveal how the blocks were hoisted, how they were positioned, and how they were made to behave as a single plane. Each cut and each retouch is a sentence in a language whose grammar we are only beginning to learn. The platform is a dense text, written in mass and silence, and it invites careful reading. Stand upon it and feel the weight of history settling into your shoes. The stone does not speak in words. It speaks in resistance and stability, in choices made for the long term. These decisions tell us less about an individual project and more about a worldview that prized permanence. The platform is not an answer. It is a challenge. It asks us to expand our sense of what ancient societies could organize, to rethink the limits of pre-industrial engineering, and to imagine projects conceived in centuries rather than seasons. When you leave the platform and look back toward the bright expanse of stone, do not search for a missing roof or a vanished statue. Search for the traces of discipline, for evidence of planning, for the scars of measurement. These are the marks of intent. In following them, we do not simply study a construction technique. We begin to recover a way of thinking that built for the ages. Stand before the megalithic platform at Baalbek long enough, and a strange realization begins to take shape, not about the stones themselves, but about the world that must once have existed around them. Because a structure like this is never just a structure. It is the visible tip of an invisible iceberg, a surviving fragment of a system vast enough, organized enough, and coordinated enough to conceive and execute something that seems, even today, unreasonable. A civilization capable of positioning 800-ton blocks with the accuracy of a jeweler does not emerge from a few isolated villages. It implies hierarchy, logistics, surplus, craftsmanship, planning, seasonal scheduling, and social stability. It implies context, but at Baalbek, the context is missing. Where are the cities? Where are the industrial zones? Where are the ports, the kilns, the quarries in continuous operation, the networks of roads feeding this place with supplies and labor? Where is the culture? This is the paradox at the heart of Baalbek, not the stones, but the silence that surrounds them. A silence so complete it feels engineered. And yet, the explanation is not conspiracy. It is not erasure. It is not some catastrophic collapse that wiped out all trace of the builders. It is something far more merciless, far more universal, far more patient. Time remembers only what is too heavy to move. Everything else dissolves. We forget this because we live in a world built from materials that feel permanent: steel, concrete, tempered glass, plastics designed to last centuries. But permanence is an illusion. The clock of geology runs slower and erodes deeper than anything we build can withstand. So let us imagine, honestly, soberly, what would remain of our own civilization if 10,000 years were allowed to roll over it like waves over sand. Start with a city like São Paulo or New York. Within a century of abandonment, the roofs collapse, the streets crack, vegetation crawls upward through the skeletons of buildings. Within 500 years, steel beams rust into flakes. Concrete turns into dust where water infiltrates. Glass shatters into microscopic grains that rain settles into the soil. Within 2,000 years, the skyline is gone. The bridges are gone. The subways are filled with sediment. The skyscrapers have become mounds. The plastic polymers have fragmented into chemical traces. Within 10,000 years, there is no city, no recognizable structure. Only the faintest, vaguest geological disturbance. A patch of soil with a slightly different chemical signature. a scatter of unnatural minerals that even a trained eye might miss. And if erosion is strong, or the water table rises, or trees grow, or an earthquake shakes the ground, even those faint clues disappear. If visitors came to our world 10,000 years after our disappearance, what would they find? Not Times Square, not airports, not factories, not railways, not books, not satellites, not servers humming in climate-controlled rooms. They would find at most what we carved from mountains or cast as monolithic stone. Maybe the Hoover Dam, maybe Mount Rushmore, maybe a few massive stone foundations from our largest monuments, maybe deep-buried tunnels carved into bedrock, and very little else. In other words, our world would look empty. And so perhaps Baalbek is not lonely because it was built by an isolated culture. Perhaps it is lonely because we are only seeing the parts that time refused to erase. Everything else, the workshops, the markets, the homes, the administrative buildings, the roads, the wooden scaffolding, the iron tools, the small shrines, the granaries, the warehouses, the living city humming with motion. All of it may have vanished simply because it was not stone. Wood decomposes. Clay collapses. Iron corrodes. Bronze oxidizes and flakes away. Leather melts into soil. Textiles turn to dust. Cordage disappears in years. Even inscriptions fade unless carved deep and sheltered from the weather. Time is not an enemy. Time is a filter. It filters out everything except what is heavy enough, dense enough, and stable enough to resist its grinding patience. Even the Roman world, far younger than the megalithic layers, survives today primarily in stone. Amphitheaters, aqueducts, foundations, pillars. Their wood, their fabrics, their food stores, their tools, their carts, their painted walls, their ships. These survive only in rare, miraculous cases. Now extend this logic backwards to a civilization potentially much older than Rome. Imagine a society that built in a hybrid way. Stone for monuments and civic centers, but wood and clay for most domestic structures. Imagine their archives on parchment, on papyrus, on wood tablets inked with carbon blacks. Imagine their tools made of iron, their machines of wood and rope. Imagine their ritual spaces decorated with woven manners, pigments, oils, and precious metals, thinly hammered treasures that wind, rain, and soil would reclaim. Now imagine the same valley after 10,000 years of weather, earthquakes, plant roots, groundwater, frost cycles, and human repurposing of materials. What survives? Only the bones, only the heaviest bones, only the megalithic skeleton. This is the melancholy truth behind Baalbek. The platform may not be mysterious because its builders were supernatural or alien. It may be mysterious because we are looking at 0.01% of what once existed. The stone is the fingerprint left on a world that has otherwise been wiped clean. Consider the scale implied by the stones themselves. They suggest administrative planning running across seasons, coordinated labor, a food surplus large enough to feed an army of workers, artisans who specialize in stonework to a superhuman degree, quarry managers, overseers, transport engineers, knowledge passed through apprenticeship, not just brute strength, a deep understanding of geometry, leverage, and organization, a cultural or religious motivation strong enough to justify the effort. These things do not arise in isolation. They require a cultural ecosystem, but ecosystems vanish. Stone remains. Perhaps the city that built Baalbek was made of timber. Perhaps its industrial zones were clay and wood. Perhaps its libraries were parchment. Perhaps its tools were iron that rusted into nothing. Perhaps its temples had wooden colonnades whose stone foundations now lie buried beneath meters of soil. Perhaps there were entire districts around the platform, erased not by cataclysm, but by ordinary time. What if Baalbek feels anomalous because we are trying to reconstruct a civilization from a single surviving vertebra? If all that remained of our world was the Hoover Dam, future archaeologists might ask, where are the tools? Where are the construction plans? Where are the cranes capable of shaping this? Where is the supporting civilization? And the answer would be, they decayed, just as this one did. So at Baalbek, we stand in a strange, haunting position. We are not seeing the civilization. We are seeing the shadow of the civilization, the only parts too heavy for time to lift away. This is the paradox. Not that the builders were impossibly advanced, not that they were impossibly primitive, but that we are trying to judge an entire culture by what time allowed to survive. A handful of indestructible stones. The rest may have been vibrant, bustling, complex, astonishing, but today it is as if it never existed. And so the question we should ask is not, where are the tools? Where are the cities? Where is the infrastructure? But rather, how many civilizations might lie beneath our timeline, hidden simply because they did not build in stone? At Baalbek, we are not staring at the whole story. We are staring at the skeleton of a forgotten titan. The flesh has decayed. The organs have disintegrated. The heartbeat has long stopped. Only the ribs remain, and they are enormous. Look around at the world we build today. Skyscrapers rise like glass arrows. Stadiums bloom like metallic flowers. Highways unfurl across continents in elegant gray ribbons. Digital cities hum invisibly inside servers, cooled by artificial wind. It feels permanent. It feels solid. It feels like we have mastered time. But the stones at Baalbek suggest otherwise. They whisper a reminder from the deep past. Nothing endures unless it was built to outlast memory itself. Modernity is fast, efficient, light, disposable by design. We build infrastructure with planned obsolescence. We construct cities that depend on constant maintenance. We rely on materials that crumble in centuries, sometimes in decades. We create digital archives that vanish the moment electricity stops. We have traded longevity for speed, endurance for scalability, memory for performance. But the megalithic builders of Baalbek, whoever they were, whenever they lived, built with a different philosophy altogether. They built for eternity, not for convenience, not for efficiency, not for quarterly reports or timelines, but for permanence so deep it borders on defiance. Stand before the platform and the contrast is jarring. We build quickly. They built forever. We build upwards. They built down into the bones of the earth. We build with networks of systems that must be fed constantly fuel, wires, grids, political stability, financial resources. They built with stones that ignore all of these. We build monuments to the ego of the present moment. They built monuments that would outlast ego itself. And this is where Baalbek reaches out of the past and puts its hand gently but firmly on our shoulder. Because our perception of time is narrow. We live in decades. Governments think in terms of election cycles. Corporations think in quarters. Individuals think in lifetimes. But geology thinks in tens of thousands of years. The builders of Baalbek intentionally or instinctively thought on the geologic timeline. That is why the Roman temple crumbled, but the platform did not move. That is why the columns shattered, but the foundation remained still. That is why everything ornamental, everything decorative, everything expressive has disappeared, while the featureless monoliths remain, untouched by the shivering of the earth. The message is subtle but unmistakable. What is big enough, heavy enough, and simple enough will survive. Everything else is noise. So what does this say about us? If our civilization vanished tonight instantly, without warning, what would we leave behind? Skyscrapers? No, they collapse in centuries. Bridges? No, they corrode into dust. Books? Paintings? Digital archives? No, none would endure. Cars? Airplanes? Gone within 1,000 years. Plastic? It would crumble long before 10,000 years have passed. So what remains? The great dams, the mountain carvings, some tunnels, some stone monuments, maybe a few mega projects carved directly into bedrock. That is all. Future archaeologists might find the Hoover Dam and assume this must have been one of their central temples. Clearly they worship water. They might find Mount Rushmore and think, these four faces, perhaps they were gods. They might find the foundations of a skyscraper and mistake them for the remains of a fortress. And everything else, the music, the art, the philosophies, the networks, the science, the dreams would be gone, completely. Just as whatever once surrounded Baalbek is gone. And so the connection becomes painfully clear. We are not superior to the builders of Baalbek in permanence. We are inferior. We have built a world that requires constant attention from billions of hands. We have built a world that blinks out if the grid falters. We have built a world whose memory evaporates the moment the servers go silent. They built a platform that will outlast every city on Earth today. And this forces a deeply uncomfortable question. What does progress mean if the past was better at speaking across millennia? Perhaps our true fragility is not technological, but temporal. Our civilization is strong in the present moment, but weak in the deep time of earth and stone. The builders of Baalbek did not just move stones. They engineered presence, a presence so enduring that it breaks through thousands of years of erosion, conquest, myth, and cultural amnesia. A presence so strong that we stand before it today feeling like children. And so Baalbek becomes a kind of mirror, not a mirror of capability, but a mirror of priorities. They chose permanence. We choose immediacy. They built for epochs. We build for decades. They crafted something that approaches immortality. We craft things that barely survive their own warranty period. The connection to the present is not in the mystery of how they moved the stones. It is in the uncomfortable awareness of what we will leave behind and how little of our greatness, our knowledge, our culture, our identity will withstand the slow but absolute justice of time. Baalbek's foundation stands like a challenge. What are you building that will still be here in 10,000 years? The silent answer is sobering. Not much. And maybe that is the most haunting implication of all. Not that the ancients were impossibly advanced, but that they understood time better than we do. That they understood stability better than we do. That they understood the meaning of leaving something behind. And that they understood something else. Civilization is fragile, but stone is patient. We live at the peak of our technological power, and yet, one day, the wind will sweep our cities clean. The forests will take back our monuments. The rivers will carve through our highways. Our knowledge will scatter like dust. And somewhere in the Bekaa Valley, the megaliths will still be there, silent, unmoved, waiting for the next curious mind to ask the same question we ask today. What kind of people built something the earth itself has not managed to erase? That is the connection between Baalbek and the present. It is a reminder that time is the ultimate archaeologist and an unforgiving one. The museum is quiet now, not the theatrical quiet of a grand hall before a performance, but the deeper quiet that settles when curiosity reaches its natural limit and the mind finally exhales. It's the hour when the last school groups have already drifted away, when the footsteps thin, when the murmurs dissolve into the air. The guards lean against doorframes. The janitors roll their carts softly down polished corridors. And you remain here, in front of the last display alone, but not really alone, because everything we've seen so far is still in the room with you. Every unanswered question, every stone that survived, every tool mark that refused to explain itself. It gathers behind your shoulders like a silent audience. You close your eyes, and for a moment, that silence becomes a canvas onto which your mind tries to project meaning. We have traveled through quarries and abandoned monoliths, through myths and logistics, through archaeology and imagination. We've seen civilizations stretch their ingenuity to the breaking point. We've watched stones rise like frozen thunderstorms. We've watched them fall again, swallowed by jungles, deserts, oceans, and time. And now, at last, you're standing in the part of the journey where everything has to make sense, or at least pretend to. But it doesn't. Not fully. Not comfortably. And maybe that's the point. What do these monuments reflect back at us when all the noise of explanation fades? When there are no more diagrams, no more timelines, no more confident voices insisting they have solved the past? What remains in the stillness? A strange double feeling. Awe and unease. Because this entire journey has revealed something that is both inspiring and unsettling. That human beings, thousands of years ago, were capable of feats that still defy the clean narrative we liked to impose on history. Where there should be clear lines, we find gaps. Where there should be answers, we find shadows shaped like answers. The monuments didn't give us certainty. They gave us a mirror. And in that mirror, we saw our own hunger to understand, to explain, to categorize the world so thoroughly that nothing can surprise us. But the ancient stones refuse to bow to that desire. They remind us that knowledge is not a straight path. It is a maze, and some corridors lead directly back to ourselves. You think again of the quarry marks, the abandoned blocks, the transportation theories, the tentative reconstructions. You replay the images, the diagrams, the scholarly debates. All of it hangs together, somewhat, but never completely. The gaps feel intentional, as if time itself curated them. Civilizations vanish. Landscapes swallow evidence. Materials decay. Stories distort. And yet the stones endure impossibly, arrogantly like the last surviving bones of creatures we never fully understood. You inhale slowly. The museum lights dim by a fraction. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for you to feel the shift. The air cools. The glass in front of you reflects your face more clearly now, merging your silhouette with the fragments of ancient engineering inside the display. For a heartbeat, it looks as though you're part of the artifact, another layer added to the timeline. And you begin to realize something crucial. This journey was never just about understanding what they were capable of. It was about understanding what we believe we are capable of, and what we fear we are not. The great monuments challenge our self-image. They whisper, you are not the first to dream big. You are not the first to push beyond what is reasonable. You are not the first to leave something behind that will outlive your entire world. The stones have been judging us, quietly, all along. And now, in this final stretch of the story, you can feel that judgment sharpening, not cruelly, but truthfully. You sense that whatever conclusion you build here must respect the weight of everything that has come before. Not an easy closure, not a neat explanation, but an honest reflection. A deep breath, a longer silence. You are ready to continue. You breathe in slowly, and the air of the Beka Valley settles in your lungs like warm dust carried across centuries. As we stand here, in this suspended moment, let's gather everything we've touched, the weight, the paradox, the silence, and bring it together gently, as though cupping water in our hands. We saw how the Roman world, vast and organized, strained to move objects a fraction of this size. We saw how emperors documented everything they achieved, yet the base of Baalbek sits beneath that historical noise like a forgotten heartbeat. We stood beside blocks so large that the human mind instinctively searches for metaphors to cope with them. Whales of stone, frozen titans, mountains taught to obey straight lines. And still the simplest truth remains. They exist. Someone shaped them, someone moved them. Someone knew how. We followed the forensic clues like archaeologists tracing fingerprints. The smooth, deeply aged surfaces, the perfect joints, the unmistakable layering of two civilizations stacked in time. Above, the ornate Roman architecture that tourists photograph. Below, The quiet, ancient precision that no empire claimed, no historian fully explained, and no textbook can comfortably place. And then we stepped into the quarry, that open wound of ambition, where the stones that never left the earth reveal the scale of what was intended. 1,000 tons, 1,600 tons. Plans that seemed to laugh at the limits of their age, or any age. Plans interrupted, abandoned, or perhaps simply overtaken by something we no longer understand. Through the lens of physics, we brought ourselves back to reality. Friction, density, compressive force, geometry. The merciless constraints of materials that even modern industry must respect. And we acknowledged what these constraints imply. Moving such stones is not hard. It is not impressive. It is, by all standard models, impossible. Unless the model is wrong. Unless the assumptions are incomplete. But the stones themselves are not incomplete. They do not theorize. They do not exaggerate. They simply are. And in the quiet space between what we know and what we see, there is a kind of humility, a reminder that human history is not a straight line of progress, but a broken loop of remembering and forgetting. Civilizations rise with brilliance, fall with silence, and leave behind fragments that challenge the arrogance of the present. We widened our gaze to the scale of time itself, geologic time, where mountains lift and crumble, where the earth digests cities as casually as a river wears down a pebble. And we understood that the people who built with megaliths were not thinking in centuries. They were thinking in permanence, in survival, in defiance of erosion and earthquakes and oblivion. They built with a material that time respects, stone too large to be erased. In all of this, we found a strange, almost unsettling comfort, that the stones speak not just of engineering, but of intention, of purpose, of a worldview where effort was measured not by how fast something could be built, but by how long it could endure. And now, as this valley darkens, as the wind moves quietly across surfaces carved before written language matured, as we let our thoughts settle into the grooves and shadows of these massive blocks, you may feel the same sensation that generations of travelers, scholars, mystics, soldiers, and wanderers have felt here. A pull, a grounding, a sense that you are not only looking at history, but standing inside it, inside a question so old that even time seems unsure how to answer. We have brushed our fingertips across this question tonight. We have walked its edges, followed its contours, held it up to the faint light of our modern understanding. And now we carry it forward, gently, like a stone in the pocket, warm from the touch, a reminder that the world is older, stranger, and more resilient than we often allow ourselves to believe. Breathe out. Let the dust settle again. The stones remain where they have always been. And we continue. The great stones of Baalbek do not speak, yet they communicate something that no text, no inscription, no carved declaration could ever express. They say, we were meant to last. And in that simple, overwhelming fact lies the first thread of our conclusion. When we stand before these blocks, not as tourists, not as engineers, not even as historians, but simply as human beings, we confront a truth older than any civilization, the desire to leave something behind, the desire to resist the erasure that time promises to all living things, the desire to carve permanence out of impermanence. It is the same desire that shaped the pyramids, the ziggurats, the dolmens, the Göbekli Tepe pillars, the Easter Island moai. But here, in the Bekaa Valley, that desire took on a new form. Not a monument, not a shrine, but a foundation. A platform for something vast, unknown, and seemingly beyond the needs of ritual or architecture. Here, the impulse toward immortality manifested not as a celebration of life, but as an anchor against the tides of time. And so we arrive at the philosophical horizon of this mystery. These stones are not just stones. They are an argument. A counter-argument to the belief that the past was primitive, linear, predictable. They refute the comforting idea that we stand at the top of a staircase of progress, looking down at every age before us. They whisper that the staircase may not be a staircase at all. It may be a circle. Every civilization rises believing it is the culmination of all that came before. Every civilization falls believing the world will remember it. But the memory of the world is selective. It preserves only what can endure the erosion of air, water, fire, and time. It keeps the bones and discards the flesh. And so Baalbek, in its immensity, warns us. Your skyscrapers will crumble. Your glass will shatter. Your metal will rust. Your knowledge will scatter like leaves in wind. Only what you build for eternity stands a chance of being eternal. We look at these stones, and they remind us that human ambition is ancient, that technological confidence is ancient, that the belief in our own permanence is ancient, and that all of these things have been wrong before. But there is another layer to this lesson, something gentler, something almost tender, because the same stones that challenge our assumptions also comfort us. They show that even when civilizations vanish, even when languages die, even when the people who labored under the sun and carved these walls have turned to dust, something remains, something persists, something survives to speak on their behalf, long after every voice has fallen silent. And what these stones say is not arrogance, it is longing, a longing to be remembered, a longing to leave a mark that time cannot erase, a longing to prove that they were here, that they lived, that they dreamed on a grand scale. And in that longing, they mirror us, because we too fear disappearing. We too want to matter. We too hope that something we do, a gesture, a creation, a connection, might outlive us, however briefly. We see ourselves in these stones, not because we could move them, but because we understand why someone would try. And so the final truth emerges quietly, like a shape in deep water rising toward the light. Baalbek is not just a mystery of engineering. It is a message about the human condition. It tells us that greatness is not measured by what a civilization builds, but by what survives. And survival is a dialogue with time, not a victory over it. The people who built these stones are gone. Their tools are gone. Their cities are gone. Their names are gone. But their will, the force of their intention, remains pressed into every surface of this megalithic foundation. It survived the earthquakes, the wars, the fires, the collapses, the invasions, the forgetting. And in surviving, it speaks across ages. We were here. We dared the impossible. We carved our existence into the earth itself. And time, though mighty, could not erase us. Perhaps that is the final gift of Baalbek, that in its immobility, its stubborn defiance of the centuries, it teaches us to reconsider what it means to live. Not to build for applause, or convenience, or speed, but to build with intention, with courage, with an eye toward the far horizon beyond our own lifetime. To build something literal or metaphorical that outlasts us. And when we hear this message, we recognize it instantly. Because it comes from the same place in us, it compels parents to tell stories to their children, artists to leave their mark on, canvas or clay lovers to write their names in tree bark, scientists to record their findings, teachers to pass on what they've learned, wanderers to leave cairns on mountain paths. The shape changes, the expression changes, but the impulse is the same. Remember me. Remember that I lived. Remember that I reached for something greater than survival. The stones answer back. We remember. There is a moment, somewhere between wakefulness and sleep, when the mind loosens its grip on the day and drifts toward the currents beneath thought. In that suspended space, the mysteries of the past feel closer, not like puzzles to be solved, but like echoes that resonate inside us. And it's in that gentle state that Baalbek reveals its most intimate truth. Because what these stones ultimately reflect has nothing to do with chronology, archaeology, or engineering. It has to do with us, with the way we navigate a world where everything changes, everything erodes, everything slips through our fingers sooner or later. It has to do with the search for something solid in a universe built on impermanence. Standing at the base of those ancient blocks, you can't help but feel small. Not belittled, just small in the same way a single wave is small compared to the ocean. You feel the immensity of time pressing around you, the people who lived and loved and worked here, the civilizations that rose, flourished, vanished, the storms that broke against the platform and left no mark on the stone. And in that immensity, a strange feeling unfolds, a quiet recognition, because the truth is that we, too, are trying to build something that lasts. We construct our identities, our memories, our relationships, our dreams, as if they were megaliths meant to withstand the earthquakes of life. We anchor ourselves in promises, routines, beliefs. We cling to the people who matter to us. We carve our hopes into the days we are given. But deep down, we know how fragile it all is. We know that a single moment can change everything, a loss, a revelation, a shift in direction so sudden it leaves us dizzy. We know that we are temporary beings trying to find stability in a temporary world. The Megaliths of Baalbek, in their silence, remind us of the tension between our desire for permanence and the reality of impermanence. And yet, instead of despair, they offer something different, a kind of solace, because they show that even if everything you build eventually crumbles, even if your world changes 100 times, even if nothing lasts the way you hoped, there is meaning in the attempt, purpose in the striving, beauty in the effort to create something solid in the midst of uncertainty. The ancient builders may not have left us their language, their stories, their names, but they left us something better, the imprint of their intention, the enduring proof that human beings have always reached for the impossible, always tried to anchor themselves against the tide. And in that sense, Baalbek becomes a mirror, not a mirror of stone, but of the soul. It reflects the part of us that longs for stability, for foundation, for grounding. The part of us that wants to feel rooted, connected, held. The part that seeks meaning in a world that offers no guarantees. It reflects the part of us that is afraid of being forgotten, afraid of losing what matters, afraid of drifting. But it also reflects the part that is brave enough to leave a mark, to love deeply, to dream boldly, to build something worth remembering. In the end, the stones whisper the same message to us that they whispered to their builders. You cannot escape impermanence, but you can shape your time on Earth into something that matters. Maybe that something is a creation, or a relationship, or a moment of kindness that echoes far beyond what you can see. Maybe it is a legacy no one else will ever recognize, but one that transforms the life of a single person. Maybe it is simply the quiet determination to live with intention, to choose meaning over apathy, to carve purpose out of passing days. Baalbek does not tell us to build monuments. It tells us to build meaning. And meaning, unlike stone, does not need to survive millennia to be real. It needs only to survive in the heart, even if just for a moment, to change everything. The stones remind us, you are temporary, but your impact does not have to be. You are fragile, but your choices can be strong. You cannot defeat time, but you can shape your place within it. And perhaps that is the greatest freedom we have. The sun is sinking now over the Bekaa Valley. Not the real sun, not the literal sky, but the one inside your imagination, the one we've been walking beneath together. The light softens, the air stills, and the long shadows of the megaliths stretch across the earth like quiet guardians settling in for the night. You can feel the shift, the warmth fading, the breeze slowing, the day exhaling as it releases its final breath. And the stones, those vast, unmoving giants, begin to take on a deeper presence. Their edges blur slightly as dusk gathers around them. Their surfaces grow darker, cooler, calmer, until they seem less like objects and more like states of being. And in that twilight, something beautiful happens. The weight that once intimidated becomes a comfort. The immensity you felt earlier, the awe, the questions, the tension of the unknown, begins to soften. The stones lose their sharpness, their mystery becomes gentler, and their silence wraps around you like a blanket being pulled up over your shoulders. Let yourself feel that weight now. Not the weight of responsibility, not the weight of worry, but the weight of grounding, the kind that steadies you, anchors you, reassures you that nothing in this moment demands effort. The earth beneath your body is still. The mattress beneath you is steady, and the world outside can wait. Imagine the great blocks of Baalbek cooling under the fading light, their massive presence radiating a kind of slow, ancient calm. They have witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations. They have endured storms, wars, earthquakes. They have stood unchanged while everything else shifted around them. And now they lend that stillness to you. Feel your breath settling into a slower rhythm, in and out, in and out, as consistent as the shadows lengthening across the stones. There is nothing to solve now, nothing to understand, nothing to hold up or hold together. The day is closing like a book, gently, page by page. You are allowed to let go. Let your thoughts drift the way dust drifts through the last rays of sunlight over the platform. Let them float, unhurried, without needing to form anything. If they land somewhere, let them. If they dissolve, let them. This is the hour when the mind no longer needs direction. This is the hour when the stones simply become quiet companions. Their solidity becomes your safety. Their permanence becomes your reassurance. Their unmovable presence becomes the soft gravity pulling you downward, not dragging, not pressing, just inviting your body to settle a little deeper, your muscles to release a little further. You are here. You are held. You are allowed to rest. As the last light fades beyond the hills, imagine the night spreading across the valley, smooth, dark, and peaceful. The temperature drops a little. The air cools against the stone. A faint echo of ancient winds moves between the blocks, whispering through cracks carved thousands of years before you were born. That whisper carries the same message it has carried for millennia. You can stop now. You can breathe. You can drift. Let that whisper move through you, loosening the last threads of the day. Let the darkness gather softly around your thoughts. Let the stone's slow, ancient calm guide you into the stillness of night. You are safe. You are steady. And the world can rest with you. And now, as the last echoes of the valley fade, as the great stones settle into their eternal silence, this story, too, comes to its gentle end. You have walked among giants. You have felt their weight, their mystery, their impossible endurance. And now, you can let all of it drift into the quiet space where dreams begin. This was another story in the endless river of time. A river that has been flowing long before you were born, and will continue long after every monument has turned to dust. Tonight, you floated along its surface, unhurried, unburdened, carried by the patience of ancient stone. And now, let that river carry you a little farther, just beyond the edge of thinking, into the warm, dark current where sleep rises to meet you. Good night, dreamer of ages. Rest in the stillness that civilizations could not disturb. Rest in the calm that even the greatest stones could not outlast. Rest in the quiet certainty that you are safe, and the world can wait until morning. And when you wake, gently, slowly, whenever your body decides, another mystery will be waiting. Another story, another journey through the forgotten corners of time. Until then, drift, soften, sleep, and remember to follow the channel so you never miss the next journey we take together, block by block, age by age, into the vast, silent beauty of the ancient world. Good night.